Shing! A sword stabbed through his older brother's chest. He watched as his father dug the sword through as if it was nothing, as if Wilbur didn't mean anything. Did he not mean anything? Was Wilbur nothing more than an afterthought? He had to be. He had to be. Tommy sniffed in. The smell of ash and smoke, oak and gunpowder littered the air, filtering in his nose like gasoline. He hated the smell. Hated it. He looked down around him. Rubble of his once glorious nation, of his home. The home that he and Wilbur had built, had made, had fought for and bled for and had done so much for. In shambles, in ruins. He now stood on the very same rock that Wilbur and him had proclaimed this was their land. He remembered standing here smiling, and saying, with his brother, in two simple words, "This is our home. This is home." But was it? Was it? He sniffed in. His blood felt like icicles. It felt like a million knives were stabbing into him all at once. His gut turned. The smell of sulfur in the air wasn't helping. He hated it. He hated it. Something wet ran down his cheeks. Perhaps blood. It had to have been blood. Or maybe even tears. Most likely tears. And a mixture of blood all in one. Blood was littering all over his face from countless of swings of knives and axe and so much. He slowly turned to look at the remaining survivors around him. Most of the rebellious refugees that had left to come and find him and Wilbur in the small, desolate cave they lived in were dead. Only about 10 or 20 remained out of the 50 people that had been in there. More than half of the refugees that had claimed to come and help them fight were dead. He'd seen death before. This hadn't been the first time. In their war of independence, more than 100 soldiers had fallen from their grace through knives and swords and crossbow and bow and even explosions of TNT. Even then, their country had fallen and from grace, but it picked itself back up. They were a free nation, free of tyranny, free from the Dream SMP. But was it really worth it? Was it worth it now? What was it that Wilbur had said? "I'm a slow burning fuse, and I will go out in an explosion of color and light. I will be a different person than the one you see here today." Wilbur had been right. Wilbur was always right. Wilbur never lied. That was the thing about Will. He always always was right. As many times as Wilbur and Tommy fought over silly things, as many times as Tommy denied that Wilbur was right, in the end, Wilbur was always right. Wilbur was his life. Wilbur was the one who raised him, not Techno, not Phil's the man that stood before him. This will be his first time meeting him. His first time. He looked at Wilbur's dead body as if it were nothing more than that, a dead body. Wasn't Wilbur man's son? Didn't that mean anything? Why did he have to die? Why did Wilbur have to die at the man's hands? It didn't make sense. Nothing made sense. Why now did he show up for his own son? Why? It wasn't fair. Why now does he get to show up? It wasn't fair. How much he wanted to scream and shout and yell at the man for leaving, and then only to come back to kill his older brother, to kill the practical father who raised him. Even if Wilbur was only 3 years older, he had raised him. You remember when Techno left? At least Techno stayed a little bit. He didn't remember the reason why Techno had left. All he knew was that his brother had left for a reason. Did Phil leave for a reason too? What was that reason? Why? What was it? Was it because of him? He had heard tales of their mother. More so from Techno than from Wilbur, but their mother was kind. Their mother had been just. Their mother was beautiful and happy and healthy. And then he had been born. He had killed her when she was pregnant with him. And killed her during his birth. She was dead because of him. His fault. His fault. His fault. All his fault. For years, he'd been blaming himself. And still was. He didn't know. And he didn't bother to ask or care. All he knew was that this man that had stuck a sword into his older brother, father's back, was not his father. This man was a stranger. This man with broken and almost obsidian-looking wings was a liar, a manipulator, a good-for-nothing, such a rand bastard. He should be hanged. Tommy looked up. There was Techno. The man had tears perking his eyes. His crimson red eyes faded to a duller, more earthy brown red look. The man's hair was covered in soot and ash and tangled in more ways than one. He had just done that braid this morning, and already it had come undone. Tommy had worked to make Techno's hair look nice. And in the casualty of war, the hair was broken. And battered, just like the rest of manburg. It was really his own fault. He supposed. Not his, more Techno's fault. Techno hadn't bothered to keep the hair kept nice. He let out a breath. He couldn't talk, couldn't speak. It felt like he was swallowing lead, better yet, glass. Felt like he was 20 leagues under the sea, and all he could see and hear was a distorted image of cries. He watched Technoblade's mouth move, but he couldn't hear it. He sniffed in. He looked upon the rubble. Techno's withers that he had spawned, both dead, and bones laying there. Dead. His brother may have been a terrorist, but he was still his brother, and he was mourning in that moment. Just like Tommy. No matter how much he could stay mad at Techno, he never really could. His brother was hurting just as much as he was. So carefully, ever so carefully, Tommy moved his stoned arms. Arms that were heavy, too heavy for himself. But he knew they weren't really made of stone. He knew that, though it felt as if he could barely move. But he did. He forced his arms to move and wrap around Techno, burying his head. He felt a hand fall upon his head, fluff of hair, and run his calm fingers through it, in a similar manner to that of what Wilbur would do, in the nights of which when Tommy would have his nightmares and couldn't get back to sleep. He heard soft murmurs of reassurance and careful compliments of beauty and grace and how he was fine and how everything would be okay, despite it really not being okay. He can now no longer smell ash fall, or rather, he still could, but it was more diluted, not really there anymore. Instead, what he smelled was the scent of warm baked cake and freshly picked strawberries and blueberries. It was the smell of Techno. He enjoyed it. He smiled as he felt his eyes get heavy. He tried to fight it, though yet another reassurance came through. This time he could hear it clearer than he had heard anything else in 1,000 minutes. No, Tommy, let it happen. It's fine. Let it happen. It's okay. So reluctantly listening to the distant voice of his eldest brother, he let his eyes close as he drifted off into a dreamless sleep.